The crayon drawing was sitting on the kitchen table when I came downstairs. My daughter Sophie, 4 years old, gap-toothed and still in her princess pajamas, was eating cereal and humming to herself like it was just another Tuesday morning. But that drawing made my blood run cold in a way I still can't fully explain. It showed our house. I recognized the blue shutters, the red door, the oak tree in the front yard. But underneath the house, drawn in black crayon with the intense pressure only a child's hand can produce, was a room. A dark rectangle beneath the foundation. And inside that room was a figure, a man, tall, thin, with no face, just a blank oval where his head should be. And Sophie had written in her messy 4-year-old handwriting, "The man in the basement." We don't have a basement. "Sophie, sweetie," I said, trying to keep my voice light even though my hands had started shaking. "What's this picture?" She looked up at me with those big brown eyes, milk on her upper lip. "That's our house, Mommy. I see that. But what's this part?" I pointed to the dark room underneath. "That's where the man lives." My throat tightened. "What man, baby?" "The man in the basement. He's there at night. Sometimes he knocks." I set down my coffee cup before I could drop it. We'd lived in this house for 8 months, a small 2-story in suburban Connecticut, built in 1987 according to the inspection report. No basement. Just a crawl space we'd been told was barely 3 feet high and only accessible from the outside. We'd never even looked at it. "Sophie, we don't have a basement, remember? Our house sits right on the ground." She shrugged, completely unconcerned, and went back to her cereal. "He's down there anyway. Kids have imaginations." I knew that. Sophie had an imaginary friend last year named Mr. Whiskers who supposedly lived in her closet. This was probably the same thing. Probably. But I couldn't shake the image of that faceless man she'd drawn with such certainty. My husband Mark was already at work. I texted him the photo of the drawing. His response came 30 seconds later. "Kids are creepy, lol." Imaginary friend. I wanted to believe that. I spent the rest of the morning trying to convince myself of that while Sophie played with her dolls, seemingly unbothered by the entity she believed lived beneath our home. But at lunchtime, when I was making her a sandwich, she said something that made me freeze. "Mommy, why doesn't the man have any windows?" "What?" "In the basement. There's no windows, it's always dark for him." "Sophie, there is no—" "And he's sad, he can't get out." I knelt down to her eye level. "Baby, did you have a bad dream? Is that what this is?" She shook her head seriously. "I hear him at night. When you and Daddy are sleeping, he knocks on the floor like this." She knocked on the kitchen table 3 times. Slow, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. My skin prickled. "Has he ever talked to you?" "No, he just knocks. I think he wants help." That afternoon, while Sophie napped, I did what any terrified mother would do. I Googled our house, the address, the history, previous owners. What I found made my stomach drop. Our house had been owned by the Hendersons from 1987 to 2003. Then it sat empty for 4 years. 4 years. The next owners, the Carsons, lived there from 2007 to 2019. Then it was sold to the Patels, who renovated and flipped it. We bought it from them 8 months ago, but those 4 empty years. Why would a perfectly good house sit vacant for 4 years? I kept digging deeper, into newspaper archives and public records, and then I found it. A news article from October 2003. Local man missing after domestic dispute. The missing man's name was Thomas Henderson, age 34, last seen at his residence, our address, after an altercation with his wife, Patricia Henderson. She claimed he'd left, walked out, never came back. The case went cold, he was never found. Patricia Henderson sold the house 3 months later, to a family who never moved in, who let it sit empty for 4 years before finally selling it. I stared at the article, at Thomas Henderson's photo. Tall, thin, dark hair, smiling in what looked like a work ID photo. Sophie had drawn a tall, thin man living in a space that didn't exist. A man who knocked. A man who couldn't get out. I called Mark. He answered on the first ring. "Hey, babe, We need to check the crawl space." "What?" Under the house, we need to check it now. Emma, what are you talking about? I told him everything. The drawing, Sophie's words, the article, the missing man. He was quiet for a long moment. You think? What? That a 34-year-old man has been living in our crawl space for 20 years. I think something happened in this house, and I think we need to look. He came home early. We waited until Sophie woke from her nap and then put on a movie to distract her while we went outside. The crawl space access was on the east side of the house, hidden behind an overgrown bush we'd been meaning to trim. A piece of lattice covered the opening, screwed in but loose. Mark pulled it off. We both crouched down with flashlights, peering into the darkness. It wasn't 3 feet high. It was at least 6. And it went deep under the house, further than our flashlights could reach. That's not a crawl space, Mark whispered. No, it's not. We looked at each other. Neither of us wanted to go in, but we had to know. Mark went first. I followed, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The space was cold, damp. It smelled like earth and something else, something old and wrong. Our flashlights caught something about 15 feet in. A wall, not foundation, an actual wall, made of cinder blocks, dividing the space, creating a room that shouldn't exist. Mark's flashlight found a door, wooden, old, locked from the outside with a rusted bolt. Oh God, I breathed. His hand was shaking as he reached for the bolt. It was stiff, rusted shut. He had to pull hard, and when it finally gave way, the metal screamed in protest. The door swung open. The smell hit us first. Decay, old death, ancient horror. And then our flashlights illuminated what was inside. I've never screamed like I did in that moment. The sound that came out of me wasn't human. It was primal, animal. The sound of every nightmare I'd ever had crystallizing into reality. Mark grabbed me, pulled me back, but not before I saw it. Him. The skeleton slumped in the corner of that tiny cinder block room, still wearing the remnants of clothes, a flannel shirt, jeans, work boots. Beside him, carved into the wall with what must have been fingernails worn to nothing, were words, "Help me, please, can't get out." We called the police. They came with lights and sirens and crime scene tape. They carried Sophie out wrapped in a blanket, her eyes wide but not scared. Just curious. They evacuated us to a hotel while they processed the scene. It took 3 days for them to confirm what we already knew. The remains belonged to Thomas Henderson. He'd been sealed in that room alive. Probably during the altercation his wife reported. Probably while she stood on the other side of that door, listening to him beg. The autopsy estimated he'd survived maybe 4 or 5 days, in complete darkness. No food, no water. Just that tiny space and the knowledge that no one was coming, that his wife had buried him alive beneath his own home. Patricia Henderson was arrested in Florida, where she'd been living under her maiden name for 2 decades. She confessed within hours, said he'd been abusive, that she'd snapped, that she'd lured him down there under the pretense of checking a leak, then locked him in. She'd planned to report him missing eventually, make it look like he'd abandoned her. And it had worked. For 20 years, it had worked. The house became a crime scene. We couldn't live there. Couldn't go back to collect our things without a police escort. Sophie stayed with my sister while Mark and I dealt with lawyers and investigators and the media circus that descended on our quiet suburban street. But the worst part wasn't the interviews or the headlines or the nightmares I still have about that smell. The worst part was what Sophie said when we finally got her back. We were in the hotel room trying to explain in 4-year-old terms why we couldn't go home, why there were police at our house, why Mommy kept crying. "Is the man okay now?" she asked, holding her favorite stuffed rabbit. I looked at Mark. He looked at me. How do you explain death to a child? How do you explain evil? The man, I started, then stopped. Sophie, how did you know about the man? She tilted her head like it was the strangest question. He told me. He told you? When? At night when I hear the knocking. He says he's stuck. He says he's scared. He says he wants his mommy. Her eyes filled with tears. I tried to help him, but I didn't know how. My blood ran cold. Sophie, baby, the man, he couldn't talk. He wasn't alive anymore. I know, she said simply. That's why he was so sad. The child psychologist we took her to said it was trauma manifestation, that Sophie had somehow sensed something wrong with the house, picked up on subconscious cues, created a narrative to explain her unease, that the knocking was probably pipes or the house settling, and her imagination filled in the rest. But I was there that first night, when she drew the picture, before we found anything, before we knew. She drew a man in a room that we didn't know existed, a man who couldn't get out. She knew. I don't care what the psychologist says. I don't care about rational explanations. My 4-year-old daughter heard a dead man knocking from beneath our house, and she tried to tell us, and we almost didn't listen. We sold the house, obviously. Took a massive loss, but didn't care. We moved across town to a new construction with no history, no basements, no crawl spaces, just a solid foundation and lots of windows and neighbors close enough to hear if you scream. Sophie doesn't talk about the man anymore. She's 5 now, gap-toothed smile replaced by a growing-up grin. She draws pictures of princesses and unicorns and sunshine, normal kid stuff. But sometimes late at night I hear her talking in her room, not to Mr. Whiskers or any other imaginary friend. Just talking softly, reassuringly, like she's comforting someone. "It's okay," I heard her say last week. "You're not stuck anymore. You can go home now." When I asked her who she was talking to, she just shrugged. "Nobody, Mommy. But I know better now. I know that children see things we don't, hear things we've trained ourselves to ignore. That the line between this world and whatever comes after is thinner for them, less defined." Thomas Henderson spent his last days in darkness, alone, terrified, calling out for help that never came. He died slowly, painfully, in a tomb his wife built for him. And somehow, 20 years later, his voice reached the only person still innocent enough to hear it. My daughter. The guilt eats at me sometimes. If we'd listened sooner. If we'd checked that first day instead of dismissing it as imagination. But then I remember, we did listen. Eventually. We found him. We brought him home to his family, gave them closure they'd been denied for 2 decades. And maybe, just maybe, we let him rest. The case made national news. Child's drawing solves 20-year-old mystery. Patricia Henderson got life in prison. Thomas Henderson's mother, 83 years old, finally got to bury her son. I think about him sometimes, about those last moments when he realized no one was coming, when the air got thin and the darkness became permanent, about the knocking, 3 slow, deliberate knocks that echoed through 20 years of silence until finally, someone heard. Sophie saved him in a way. Not his life. That was gone long before we moved in. But his story, his truth, his chance to be found. People ask me if I'm angry that we bought a house with a body sealed beneath it, if I'm traumatized, if Sophie will need therapy forever. But mostly, I'm grateful. Grateful that my daughter has a gift I don't understand. Grateful that she listened when the man in the basement knocked. Grateful that she drew that picture on a Tuesday morning and made us look deeper, because some voices shouldn't be ignored. Some knockings shouldn't be dismissed. And some children see the truth that adults have forgotten how to recognize. There is no basement in our new house. Sophie has checked. She says it's quiet here, safe, no one's trapped, no one's knocking. And every night before she falls asleep, she whispers the same thing. "You're okay now. You're free." I don't know if she's talking to Thomas Henderson or to some other lost soul only she can hear. But I hope, God, I hope they're listening. Because sometimes the scariest stories aren't about the monsters in the basement. They're about the monsters who put them there, and the innocents who won't let them be forgotten.